We're now on Daf Chaf Hey Amid Beis, and we're studying the sugya of Vridim. This is the sugya of Rabbi Yirmiyah. And what is this business about Vridim? The animal has on two sides of the esophagus vessels, blood vessels, which are called Vridim. And they are going to spurt forth the blood of the shechita. Now, the blood of the shechita in the vridim has to go directly into the mizrach. So therefore, even before he does the shechita, the shochet has to, again, this is a he has to do this very carefully. He has to grab onto the vridim such that immediately as he shechts the animal, the dam in the vridim goes directly into the mizrach. Because only then is the dam going to be received directly from the neck of the animal into the klisharis, into the mizrach. So therefore, he basically places the vridim into the klisharis before the shechita. Again, I don't know exactly how he pulls this off, but like he's grabbing on to the neck of the animal, and it's already okay. So now this is going to introduce us to the sugya called avir. What is the sugya of avir about? It means if you have something that is falling into a receptacle, but right now, at the present moment, it's in the airspace of the vessel, but it's sofa lanuach. It's going to eventually fall into the receptacle. And the receptacle is going to collect, in this particular context, the dam that's coming down through the airspace from the vridim into the receptacle, into this mizrach. It's very important that the vridim, since the Kohen Hashochet grabbed onto the vridim, are over the airspace of the mizrach. Boy minei Rav Asi Rav Yochanan. Now that we're talking about avir, we have the following question. If as the Kohen was receiving the dam in the mizrach, nifchasu shulei mizrach ad shelo igia dam li avir. Right, there's airspace above the rim of the mizrach, and then there's airspace inside the bowl itself. And now the Gemara vacillates. Rav Asi asks his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, the following question: what happens if the bottom of the bowl, which is called Shulei Mizrach, falls apart? And now the dam of the vridim is in the airspace, but it didn't arrive at the airspace inside the bowl, because that would certainly, if it had done that before the bottom of the bowl gave way, it would certainly be considered as if it was received in the bowl, because the avir of the bowl is considered like the bottom of the bowl. But here, while it was in the airspace above the bowl, the bottom of the bowl fell through. Mo, avir shein sofel enu kemunach domi, o lo kemunach domi. Let me go backwards. Lo kemunach domi. You can't consider, even though you know that the dam is going to fall into the mizrach, you can't consider it as if it fell into the mizrach. The dam that was already in the airspace of the mizrach, and the bottom of the bowl hadn't yet given way, that's considered sofa lanuach. It will definitely arrive and be received in the bottom of the bowl. That's already considered nach in the bowl. And if, let's say, the bowl would spill over, he can just simply collect the dam from the floor of the azor. But here we're talking about a case where before the dam reaches the inside of the bowl, the airspace inside the bowl, at that point, the bottom of the bowl gave way. So you can't say that it's sofol anuach, that eventually it's going to be collected in the kli. It cannot be collected in the kli because the bottom of the kli gave way. The other tzad in the Gemara was avir shein sofol anuach, kimunach dami. Even though by the time the blood reached the airspace of the mizrach, the bottom of the mizrach was gone, but nevertheless, once it reaches the airspace above the bowl, above the rims of the bowl or the sides of the bowl, it's already sofel anuach. And at that point in time, there was a bottom of the receptacle. So Rabbi Yochanan responded by bringing a brisa to Nisua. Okay, now, by way of introduction, we're entering into another sugya. And that's the sugya of paraduma. Now, in the case of paraduma, when they burn the para, they collect its ashes, but the ashes have to be mixed into mayim. And that mayim has to be mayim chayim. So it's got to be water that comes directly from a natural source, like a river or a spring. And it cannot go through a kli. If it goes through a kli, then it's possible to be used for paraduma. Now, we're going to learn a brisa regarding the water that has to be mixed with the ashes, the afer, the paraduma, chavis. Okay, chavis is a receptacle, and the water of the spring is going through a pipe, and it's going to be collected in this kli. Shemunachas tachas hazinuk. Zinuk is the flow of the water from the river through this pipe. Now we have to understand one thing. The pipe itself is not a kli. And the reason for that is because it's open on both sides, both ends. A kli has to have a receptacle that's closed on one side. But now the water is jetting out of this pipe, and he's got a chavis underneath the jet spring of water. So that water, which now is in the airspace above the chavis, is going to eventually fall into the chavis. Which would mean, therefore, if let's say he would grab onto that water before it reached the chavis, then it would be considered avir shesofel anuach, and since it's avir shesofel anuach, it's going through the airspace to be collected by this kli, it's already possible. And the brisa differentiates. Mayim shebetocha v'shebechutza la psulim. The distinction could be made between the water that's already inside the chavis, that's certainly possible, because it was collected in a kli, and the water that is outside the airspace of the chavis, that also is possible. And this, says Rabbi Yochanan, is going to be proof positive that avir shesofel anuach kimunach dami, that even though it's only in the airspace, it's coming out of this pipe, and it's now in the air before it reaches the chavis, it's already considered as if it's in the chavis, and if you grab onto that water and stop it before it reaches the chavis, it's possible, because avir shesofel anuach kimunach dami. Now, the next part of the brisa is not so much relevant to us, and it's simple, and it's very simple and straightforward. And we can almost skip over it to follow the logical dialogue of the Gemara. But anyway, Tserev Pia Lazinok. Now what he does is he takes the lip, the opening of the jug, lifts up the jug, and pushes it against the pipe. So therefore, Maim Shebetocho, Psulim. Obviously, any water that goes from the jet spring through the pipes into this jug, which is already attached to the pipe, is possible. However, shebechutzalok sherit. Okay, let's try to understand shebechutzalok sherit. So again, he lifted up this jug, held the mouth of the jug over the mouth of the pipe. There's no airspace now between the pipe and the jug. The water that has emerged from the pipe and enters into the jug is possible because it was collected in a kli. However, there's water that has not yet emerged from the pipe, and it's still in the pipe, and we say that the pipe is not a kli. That water is kosher. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan derives the conclusion from the reisha of this brisa that mayim shesofel anuach kimunach domi. Frek the Gemara, hi mai. What kind of answer did Rabbi Yochanan give to the question of Rav Asi of his Talmud? Boy mine, what Rav Asi was asking was avisha ain't sofel anuach. He was asking about the case where the mizrach had a bottom and the bottom just gave way. And therefore, the dam that's coming out of the neck of the animal, the vridim, is going to fall into the mizrach, but it's ein sofel anuach. It's not going to be collected by the receptacle because the bottom of it gave way. And kapashet lehavish sofel anuach, and Rav Yochanan gave an answer to his Talmud Rav Asi from a case of sofel anuach, avish sofel anuach, right? The water coming out of the pipe is going to be collected in the chavis, and the chavis has a bottom to it. And therefore we consider that water as possible in the reisha of this brisa of paraduma. So it doesn't seem like Rabbi Yochanan is speaking the same language as Rav Asi. And the Gemara answers, Tarti kaboile mine. The Rav Asi really had asked two questions. Question number one, and like a flowchart, and if you'll assume the answer to the question number one is this way, X, then I introduce question number two. Question number one was about the case of the Mizrach, which is called Avir She'ein Sofel Anuach. Why? Because the bottom of the Mizrach gave way. Imtim Salomar, and if you'll tell me Avir She'ein Sofel Anuach Lav Kimunach Domi, since the dam in the airspace is not going to eventually be collected in the bottom of the mizrach, because the bottom of the mizrach gave way, and therefore we don't consider it as sofel anuach, and therefore the dam is going to be possible for zrika. Then I introduce my second question: avish sofel anuach mai. What about avir that will eventually be collected in a chavis? For example, in the case of mayim for paraduma, do we say that once it reaches the airspace, it came out of the pipe and it's in the airspace on its way down to the chavis, and it's sofel anuach because the chavis has a bottom to it and it'll be collected there? Do we say that the mayim is already possible and it's considered kimunach dami? It's if it's already in the kli, in the chavis. So basically, Rabbi Yochanan gave two answers to two questions. Number one, he quoted the case of paraduma to prove that avisha ein sofel anuach lav kimunach domi. Number two, he derives from that brisa of paraduma that avisha sofel anuach kimunach domi. Rav Yossi machni hachi. Everything that we learned until now was the way Rav Yossi presented the back and forth, the dialogue between Rav Asi and Rav Yochanan. However, Rav Kahana Masni, he had a slightly different presentation of the discussion back and forth between Rav Asi and Rabbi Yochanan. Chavis boy minei. The original question was about the paraduma case of the spring water that's entering into the airspace of the jug, which is called the chavis, right? Upashet le chavis. And he actually gave him an answer regarding the chavis, meaning the whole discussion was not about dam after the shchita that was in the airspace of the Mizrach, but rather it was about spring water going through the pipes in the airspace of the chavis. Rabba Masni, Rabba had a third presentation of the dialogue, chavis boy minei upashet le Mizrach, just the opposite of what we said until now. The original question was about paraduma and the spring water that's flowing through the air on its way down to the chavis. But the resolution that Rabbi Yochanan offered to that problem in paraduma was Mizrach, was the dam that's in the airspace of the Mizrach, the receptacle that's receiving the dam. How did Rabbi Yochanan resolve the question of paraduma from the dam of shchita in Kabbalah's dam of karbonos? Iatamode. Rabbi Yochanan was sort of presenting a rhetorical question to Rav Asi. He says, wouldn't you admit that Mizrach, she efshar lo below zinuk? Right? When you shech the animal, it's 100% predictable that the dam that's going to spurt out of the neck of the animal is going to, the word zinuk means like horizontal, right? It's going to go horizontally. And as a result, it's going to travel through airspace. And therefore, maybe you're going to tell me that there's no such thing and no possibility of Kabbalah Saddam. You have undermined Kabbalah Saddam unless you assume that Avir Shesofel Anuach Kimunach Domi. If not, if you're going to interrupt it by saying, well, the dam is somewhere else, it's not in the Mizrach, then he never receives the dam in the Mizrach directly from the animal's neck. And you basically undermine the entire entity of Kabbalah Saddam. The answer must be that since the dam is being held up when the shochet grabs onto the vridim over the bowl, the blood spurts into the airspace of the bowl and it's considered as if it's in the bowl. So it went directly into the bowl. And therefore, we have to assume that Avir Shesofel Anuach Kimunach Domi. And therefore, we're going to apply the same principle to L'chumra instead of L'kula, meaning Lifsol instead of L'hachshir. In the case of the water that comes from the spring through the pipes, and we're going to say that once it enters into the jug, the airspace of the jug, it's considered as if it is inside the jug. It's already been received the jug because the jug has a bottom, and therefore it's possible. Tanan Hasam. This is a Mishnah now in Masechta Parah. Nasan yodo o raglo o ale yerokos. Okay, so now we're going to have a discussion about what exactly constitutes a kli, such that if the spring water was received in that particular kind of utensil, it's possible. So we have now something called ale yerokos. Now, in order for a kli to qualify as a kli, just 1 second. Just 1 second. I just need just to make sure one thing. Yeah. I got it. We're talking now about the pipe in inverted commas, right? The pipe that draws the water from the spring, and we want to know whether that pipe qualifies as a kli, which would invalidate the water for paraduma, or it does not qualify as a kli. So the Mishnah in Para says the following: that if he uses vegetable leaves, that's called ale yerokos, in order to draw the water from the spring into the jug, then immediately when the water passes through these ale yerokos, the water becomes possible, even before it reaches the kli. However, ale konim v'ale agozim, if he draws the water from the spring through reeds that are made of leaves or walnuts, then it's kshera. Why? So let's understand the difference between ale yerokos on the one hand and ale konim, ale agozim on the other hand. Davar shemaka Davar makabel tuma psulin. Davar she'ena makabel tuma sherin. Okay. The water can pass through something that's not makabel tuma. For example, the reeds and the walnuts. The leaves of the reeds and the leaves of the walnuts. Why? Because these are inedible. And if they're inedible, that's called a davar she'ena makabel tuma. In order for something to be makabel tuma, it has to have a status of an ochel or a kli. So kelim are makabel tuma and ochlin are makabel tuma. But there's something beini that's neither kli nor ochel. It has neither identity. It falls between the cracks, and it's not makabel tuma. And that substance is neither a kli because it's just being used to, convey the water from one opening to the other opening. So it's not a kli that has a receptacle that accepts something and keeps it. And it's not an ochel because it's not edible. So in the case of reeds, right, which was the ale yerokos made of vegetable leaves, believe it or not, those vegetable leaves are edible. If the material used to channel the water into the jug is something that is unsusceptible to tumah, the water is valid for the paraduma. If it is something that is susceptible to tumah, the water is invalid. Now, a person's body is susceptible to tumah, and so are ole yerokos, because they are ochlin. However, reed leaves and walnut leaves are, number one, inedible, and number two, they're not kalim. So the Mishnah rules, therefore, if one channeled the spring water into a jug with his hand, his foot, edible vegetable leaves, it's possible. But if he channeled it with reed leaves or walnut leaves, it is kosher. And the reason for that is that bimonishaf, it's not ochlin nor kalim. Binone mili. Tiamar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi Mishum Omar Kra Ach Mayan Ubar Mikve Mayim Yeh Tohar Haviyasan Al Yidei Taratia. So you see the word Yeh. Yeh means it is created by. And the Mayan that gives us this Mayim, the spring that provides the water for the Tara purposes of paraduma, has to be Yeh. And Yeh means Yeh b'tara, tahara tehe, with something that's not makabel tumah. So the way that you get the water and convey it from the spring into the ashes has to be done through something that's tar, that by definition is tar, because it doesn't have the capacity of being susceptible to tum. It's neither a kli nor an oak. Omer Rav Chia, Omer Rav Yochanan. So meris avri kli kikli dom. Right? What we're talking about here is the case where the water that's streaming through the pipes from the river is channeled into the chavis, meaning the mouth of the jug, and it's going through the avir of the chavis. Omar lei Rabbi Chia l'Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rab Zera l'Rabbi Chia bar Abba. V'dilma b'shoses. How do you know that the Mishnah is talking about a case where there's a jet stream and therefore goes through the airspace towards the Kli, and that's why the Mishnah apostles it? Maybe the Mishnah is talking about a case where the Mayim doesn't go through the airspace at all. Now, how is it possible that the Mayim coming through these pipes do not hit the airspace? And the answer is b'shoses. Now, literally, the word b'shoses means it comes out drop by drop. It trickles forward. Amalei, so Reb Zera immediately responds, Tarda. Tarda is a very strong language. You're making no sense. Kadeshi Yavru Mayim L'Chavis Tnan. The Mishnah can't possibly talk about a case where the water is trickling without going through any airspace, because the Mishnah says Kadeshi Yavru Mayim L'Chavis. And the word Yavru means that it's got to pass over the chavis. Now, what does it mean to pass over the chavis? It's not trickling into the chavis, it's passing over the airspace of the chavis. The Amar Rab Chia bar Abba Amar Rab Yochanan may do so Sharabi Tzadok Nishnes Mishnah Zu. We would learn this Mishnah based on the tradition of Rabbi Tzadok, a certain transmission of Rabbi Tzadok. It's not. And now we're going to learn a Mishnah in Edios, which we skipped in the Daf Yomi right before Zevachim. Heyid Rabbi Tzadok al hazochalin shekilchan be'alei gozim shenksherim. Right, if the spring water was channeled through these walnut leaves, which are not edible, then the mayim is ksherim. And Zelia Maisa Boil, it took place actually in a place called Loyo. But Maisa Chacham, Yelushkin does this, Vichshiru. So again, the Mishnah itself was based on a discussion of the Chachamim of the Sanhedrin in the Lishkas Hagazis, which was located outside the Beis Hamikdash, because they were machshir, the water that came through the pipes and was drawn by a goze, ole a goze, which are not makabel tomorrow. Reb Zera Amar Rebbe, hatsorem ozen apar v'achka kibel domo posel. Okay, we're going to have to learn this together. The Kohen nicked the ear of the par after it's shchita and receive the blood that came out of the ear of the par. And that's going to passel the carbon. Why? Shenemar v'lokach midam hapar par shahoya kfar. Now, literally translated, par shahoya kfar means the par that was previously in existence. The word v'lokach means Kabbalah. Reb Zera points out that when it says ha-par with a hey, with regard to Kabbalah, the dam has to be received from the very same par that was slaughtered. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, it's the same. He didn't bring in another par. But it means that if before the blood was received, the animal became a balas mum because it had a nick in the ear, and that's a mum. Like the Gemara says in Gittin, that's how in Kamsa Bar Kamsa they were able to, tell on the Jews because they cut the carbon with under its ear. So basically, Reb Zera is saying that if the ear got nicked between Shechita and Kabbalah, it's possible. Now, obviously, we're not operating with the principle here of Avish Sofa Lanuach Kimunach Domi. I'm not sure why. So right now, we'll leave that as an unanswered question. Ashkan Kochi Kochim Kochim Kalmi Nolon. How do we know that the derivation from Dam Hapor Par Kfar means that if the animal develops a mum between the Shechita and the Kabbalah, it's possible. The pasuk is referring to Suchatos, which is Kochim Kochim. And that's called the Chatos of the Kohen Mashuach. But Kochim Kochim are more Lakula, with many, many leniencies vis-a-vis Kochim, and therefore maybe this halacha that there cannot be a psul of mum in the animal after the shechita, before the Kabbalah, maybe that doesn't apply to shlomit and the like. Omar Rava, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Se tamim zachar ben shana. And we're talking now in Shmos Perek Yud Beis about the seh, right? The lamb of a Korban Pesach. It's got to be male, and it's got to be within the first year of its life. Shei Tomim uben shana b'shas shchita. That means that at the time of the shchita, which is within the first year of its life, it's got to be tomim. It's got to be unblemished. Okay, fine. So that's a din at the time of the shechita. How do we know that if the lamb was tamim without a mum at the time of the shechita, maybe that's enough, and I couldn't care less if subsequent to the shechita, at the time of the Kabbalah, etc., it developed a blemish. Tamalomer yeh kol havayasan lo yu elatam uben shnasa. All the four avodos, culminating in the zrika, which makes the carbon into a carbon, they all have to be done in a tamid, meaning an animal that's unblemished. So you see that even after the shechita itself, if the animal develops a blemish between the shechita and the kabbalas adam, then the korban is possible. And the Gemara says, Esvei Abaye, Abaye challenges Rava, and he says, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, let's read the end of the brisa, and it says there that according to Rabbi Yeshua, Kol Zevachim Shabbat Torah, Shenishtayer Mehem Kizayis Poso, Kizayis Chelev, Zorik Es Adam, and Tirgemua Aben Shona. So Rabbi Yeshua makes this statement with regarding all Zevachim. Now, all Zevachim meaning that you need Shchita, and then the basar of the korban if it was destroyed or it became tameh, then it all depends. Nishtayerman kizayis basar kizayis chelev. If we're left even after the destruction with a minimum of an olive size volume of meat or an olive size volume of chelev, is then zorik hasadah. He can go ahead and do the zrika. If only an olive's volume of the basar is left intact after this destruction, we're talking about, obviously, that the animal is in a blemished state. I mean, otherwise it doesn't make sense to say nishtayr ben kazai. And yet the brisa says zorek es hadam, which means that it's kosher. So the Gemara therefore says we have no choice but tirgemua aben shana, that the Pesach has to be in its original state through all the avodos within the first year. But there's no discussion here in the brisa about whether the seh or all zvachim have to be tamim. That's not the discussion. The discussion is regarding all the avodos. So with regard to Kachim Kalim, we still don't have a pasuk to teach us that the korban has to remain in a state of tamim without any blemish, even after shechita. But nevertheless, we don't need a pasuk for this, because the Torah tells us that Kodshei Kodshim has to remain in a state of tamim until the Kabbalas Adam. And therefore we apply the same rule to Kodshim Kalim. So according to Abaye, who is attacking Rava, the only makar that requires that the animal be tamim after shchita, that's the original statement of Rabbi Zera, who derived from the case of the par of the Kohen Gadol, that the par has to remain tamim up until including the Kabbalas Adam. Rabbi Yeshua in the brisa that we just learned, he's not contradicting Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yeshua is just teaching us that a mum does not passel the zrika. Again, Rabbi Yeshua is teaching us that a mum does not invalidate the zrika. Rabbi Zera said that it invalidates the Kabbalah. So we got up to Umi Ika Midi. Let's just see what time it is. I think we have 2 more minutes, maybe. Fragt die Gemara, Umi kamidi de b'shas shchita ben shana, b'shas holachu zrika ben shnatayin. How could you have such a case where at the time that we got to the holacha and the zrika, it left its first year? Amar Rava, zosomer shos posos b'kodshim. That an animal is considered that it entered into the second year of its life, even if we calculate the precise moment or the hour of the day in which it was born, and we add another year to it. So if an animal was born on the 14th of Nisan at 9 hours of the day, then if we fast forward another year, when it enters into the second year, and it's already 9 hours into the 14th of Nisan, it's already out of the first year. So if an animal was slaughtered during the 9th hour, and for some reason they delayed the Zrika until after nightfall of the 10th, then that Zrika is possible because the animal has already entered into its second year. And he points out a Gemara Nida that this rule that the Emas Kodshim is reckoned from the hour of its birth is derived by the Gemara Nida from the pasuk Tovi Keves Ben Shnasa. Ben Shnasa means in its first year. So we're not going to calculate the new year based on Tishrei, but rather the hour of its birth. Omer Rav Hami, Omer Rav Elazar, Hi b'fnim v'raglayim b'chutz, chatach v'yachach shochat kshera. So if the carbon is inside the azara, but the legs are outside, so I don't know if the animal is maybe lying on its back, stretching out its legs outside of the azara, and now the Kohen shechts the animal. Is chatach v'yachkach shochat kshera. So he did chatach first. So once he does chatach, then at the time of the shechita, the animal is entirely inside the azara. Because what was the problem? That the legs were stretched out outside the azara. But he took away the legs. Again, how does he do that without making it into a treifa? And on the top of chavav, shachav yakach chatach psula, right? Because the legs were outside the azara, so it's considered shchutei chutz. Chatach v'yachach shochat kshera. Oh, Balmum Kamakar, our question. If he cuts off the legs before the shechita, then at the time of the shechita, the animal has a mum. In fact, the animal is a treifa. Ela emo, we have to reformulate this brisa. Chatach v'yachach kibel kshera, kibel v'yachach chatach psula. If after the shechita, chatach, then he cuts off the legs, and then he's makabel adam. Now we said that the animal cannot become a balas mum between the shechita and the kabbalah. So in this case, the animal became a balas mum between the shechita and the kabbalah, and yet Ravami says it's kshera. But kibel v'achakach chatach psula. So this doesn't make any sense, because even though he did the cutting of the legs after the shechita, but he did it before the Kabbalah. So that's Gemara asks, Chotach v'yaka kibel ksheira, how could that be? V'omer abzera tzorim ozen b'bechor v'yaka kibel dom apostle, right? Because when he's tzorim the ozen, it now becomes a balas mum, and that happened before the Kabbalah Saddam, therefore it's possible. She never lokach midam apar, par shahayikvar. It was already in existence. And the Gemara answers, Omer Rav Chizda, Omer Avimi, chotech bi'ever ad shemagia le'etzem. I think we'll stop over here, and Bli Neder will have to pick up Rav Chizda in the name of Rav Avimi tomorrow, even though we're in the middle of a sugi. Okay, then, so let me wish you a good moed, and B'mirtz Hashem, we were able to do Daf Chaf Hey. We're keeping up, hopefully, in Zevachim.